I wanted to work through some of the problems you shared with me, and the directions you showed were to use long division and then synthetic division. So let's look first at the long division. I notice that the n minus 6, the second expression, is the part that comes after divided by, goes on the outside, right? And then the n cubed minus 7n squared minus 3n plus 62, the first part goes on the inside of this bracket. Off to the side, I wouldn't say on a scrap paper, I'd say on the same page, but off to the side, I'm going to write that n cubed and divide it by n. And I do this off to the side so that I don't make a mistake trying to do it mentally. N cubed divided by m, that's n to the 3 minus 1, or n squared, right? So I'm going to write the n squared above the n squared term. It's 1 n squared, so I'll write the 1 n squared above the n squared term. After you divide, you do the multiply. So then I'll say n squared times n minus 6. It's just distributing, right? So n squared times n is n cubed. N squared times negative 6 is negative 6n squared. I'm going to write that underneath and lining it up in the right places like this. And here's where the most common error would occur, because I want to subtract this whole thing. But by subtracting the whole pink thing, the n cubed minus 6n squared, really what I'm doing is I'm going to change this to adding. I'm subtracting n cubed and subtracting negative 6n squared, so I can use another color and change those signs to their opposites. And now I'll just add n cubed plus negative n cubed. That cancels out, it's 0. Negative 7n squared plus 6n squared is negative n squared. Now I'm ready to bring down, so negative 3n, and ready to go all over again. Negative n squared divided by n is negative n, because we have this negative, don't lose that, but it's 2 minus the 1 in the denominator. So 2 minus 1 is 1, so it's just negative n, right? Or I should say the opposite of n. So I'll write the opposite of n at the top, and now I'm ready to multiply. And remember, the multiplying is really, it's just distributing. So negative n times n is the opposite of n squared. Negative times negative is a positive 6n, and I'll write that over here now. And then I'm ready to subtract again. So I'm subtracting this whole thing. That's the same thing as adding the opposites. So I change each of those to their opposites and add. Negative n squared plus n squared cancels, that's 0. Negative 3n plus negative 6n is negative 9n, and bring down the 62. One more time. Now I have negative 9n divided by n, so the n's divide out and we have a negative 9. And now it's time to multiply. So negative 9 times n minus 6, distributing, is negative 9 times n, negative 9n. Negative 9 times negative 6 is positive 54. Don't forget that we're subtracting. So because we're subtracting this whole thing, it's the same as adding the opposite. So I change each of these to their opposites. Oh, I just noticed I have a mistake here, right? Because, let me see what I did here. Negative 9 times n should have been negative 9n. Sorry about that. And so when I changed, let me go back just to make sure I'm not confusing you with this. Sorry about that. So notice that you can find your mistakes as you go if the things don't cancel one another, right? So we had negative 9n plus 54. And what I want to do is subtract that whole thing. So subtracting that, it's the same thing as adding the opposite. So I change this negative 9n to a positive, and this positive 54 to a negative. And now when I add them, negative 9n plus 9n cancels out. 62 minus 54, it's going to be a positive 8. And so that's our remainder. I'm not sure how your teacher is asking you to write the remainder, but if it is just remainder 8, you could do that. Otherwise, you could say plus 8 over n minus 6. And this would be the answer. Let's look at the same example with the synthetic division. For synthetic division, I'm going to look at this n cubed, negative 7n squared, negative 3n, plus 62, and just take the coefficient. So coefficient of n cubed is 1. Coefficient of n squared, negative 7n squared is negative 7. Coefficient of negative 3n is negative 3. And then a 62. I'm going to put a backwards bracket, and I'm going to write in here a 6. Notice that that's the opposite. Since this is minus already, I'm just going to take the 6. It's always the opposite. So if this is a negative, if it's n minus something, the number I write here will be positive. And I draw a vertical line across, or a horizontal line across the bottom of the problem. And this is the process. It's really easy once you get started with it. You bring down, and then you just multiply, add, multiply, add. So we'll start by bringing down the 62. And then I'm going to multiply 62 times 6. You could pull out a calculator and do that. 62 times 6 is 372. And then I'm going to add 372 to negative 3. 372. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Just realized I don't know why I was doing that. For synthetic division, you actually start at the first one. So we bring down this 1. Sorry about that. And then 1 times 6 is 6. 6 plus negative 7 is negative 1. Negative 1 times 6 is negative 6. Negative 6 plus negative 3 is negative 9. Negative 9 times 6 is negative 54. And negative 54 plus 62 is positive 8. Let me walk you through that one more time, just in case you missed what I was doing, because I was doing that kind of fast. You start with the bring down. So we bring down this 1. And then you multiply 1 times 6. And you put that answer here. And then add negative 7 plus 6 is negative 1. And then you start over again with multiply. Negative 1 times 6 is negative 6. And add negative 6 plus negative 3 is negative 9. And then keep repeating until you run out of numbers. Negative 9 times 6 is negative 54. Negative 54 plus 62 is 8. And that's it. Notice that since I was dividing by, let me get a color on here. I started with this n cubed. So when I divide by an n term, what's going to happen is I'll have 1, the degree, the 3 would drop by 1. So what I do, the last step is in front of, or this, behind this 1, I'm going to write n squared. It was 1 less than the n cubed. And then n, and then this is like an n to the 0, but anything to the 0 power is 1, so it goes away. And then this is the remainder. Do you see how you get the same answer? N squared minus n minus 9, remainder 8. And that's it. This isn't an easy process. It's easy after you've practiced it a few times, but it's not really easy on its just by itself. So let me try another one for you. If we did n cubed divided by n, you have n squared, and I'll write the n squared here. N squared times n minus 2 is n cubed minus 2n squared. Here's where you got to be really careful not to forget what you're doing, because we're subtracting this whole thing, right? So it's the same thing as adding, it's opposite. So we change each thing to its opposite. And then these will always cancel out if we've multiplied correctly. Negative 10 plus 2 is negative 8, so we have negative 8 n squared, and then we're ready to bring down the 14n. Ready to start all over again. So we now have negative 8n squared divided by n is negative 8n. I write that on the top of the bracket above the n term, and then it's time to multiply. Multiply by n minus 2. Negative 8n squared plus 16n. And I'll write that negative 8n squared plus 16n. Now remember what we're going to do. We're going to subtract here, right? We're going to subtract that. So what we do when we subtract is we just change each of these to their opposite. So 8n squared added to negative, when I change them to their opposite, now it's addition, right? So negative, or positive 8n squared and negative 8n squared, those cancel out. 14 plus negative 16 is negative 2, so negative 2n. And I'm ready to bring down the 14. I have negative 2n, and I'll divide by n, and that's negative 2. Multiply it by n minus 2, or in other words, distribute. We have negative 2n plus 4. Remember that we're subtracting here, so that means I've got to change both of these to their opposite. Negative 2n plus 2n always cancels out if I've not made a mistake. And then 14 minus 4 is positive 10, which is the remainder. Sometimes your textbook is going to want you to write that remainder as the 10 over n minus 2. Let's look at this one with synthetic division. Can you pull out the coefficients? 1, negative 10, 14, 14. And since this is already a subtract, I'm going to write a 2 in here, right? It's always the opposite. Remember the process, bring down the 1, multiply, 1 times 2 is 2, add negative 10 plus 2 is negative 8, multiply negative 8 times 2, negative 16, add negative 16 plus 14 is negative 2, multiply negative 2 times 2 is negative 4, and add to get 10. Do you see how we get the same answer? Here's our 10 remainder. And if I go in and fill in the variables with their powers, I'm going to start 1 less than n cubed. So that's n squared, and then n, and then the constant, and look at what we have. N squared minus 8n minus 2, remainder 10. I hope that that helps. Please let me know if you are confused at all on any part, and I'd be happy to give more explanation.